What if I told you that Jesus, yes, that Jesus, once warned his closest listeners not to fast, not to pray, and not to give alms? Not because these acts were evil, but because they could blind you. This isn't a provocation pulled from modern skepticism. It comes from an ancient buried text, the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that was excluded from the Bible and hidden for nearly 2,000 years in the sands of Egypt. When it resurfaced in 1945, it carried words so unsettling, so radically interior, that they threatened the very foundations of institutional religion. In one short saying, Jesus declares, "If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves. If you pray, you will be condemned. If you give alms, you will harm your spirits." No miracles, no parables, just a blade of truth. Why would a spiritual master say such a thing? Why would fasting, prayer, and charity, acts praised across religions, be framed as dangers rather than virtues? And more importantly, what did Jesus mean that most readers still miss today? This video is not about dismissing spiritual discipline. It is about exposing the trap hidden inside it. Because according to Thomas, the real danger is not ignorance. It is performative holiness. It is mistaking outer acts for inner awakening. It is using ritual to avoid transformation, morality to avoid truth, and devotion to avoid self-knowledge. Tonight, we are going to descend beneath the surface of this shocking saying. We'll explore the world in which it was spoken, a world of mystics, Gnostics, and inner alchemists. We'll uncover why these teachings were suppressed, misunderstood, and later reframed to support control rather than consciousness. And step by step, we'll decode what Jesus was actually pointing toward. A spirituality without intermediaries, without theater, without ego. This is not the Jesus of temples and titles. This is the Jesus who whispers, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you." Stay with me. Because once you understand why Jesus said, "Do not fast, pray, or give alms," you may never approach spirituality the same way again. To understand why this saying shocks us, we must first step out of the modern religious mindset and return to the volatile spiritual landscape of the 1st and 2nd centuries. This was not a world of unified Christianity. It was a battlefield of ideas. Mystics, philosophers, apocalyptic prophets, and inner alchemists, all wrestling over one question. How does a human being awaken to the divine? The Gospel of Thomas emerged from this crucible. Unlike the canonical Gospels, Thomas is not a narrative. There is no birth story, no crucifixion, no resurrection drama. Instead, it is a collection of 114 sayings, raw, uncompromising, and inward-facing. Many scholars trace its roots to early mystical movements often labeled Gnostic, though that word itself is a later simplification. These groups were less interested in obedience and far more concerned with direct knowing, gnosis, an experiential realization of divine truth within oneself. In this worldview, salvation was not something granted later, after death. It was something remembered now. This immediately placed Thomas at odds with the emerging institutional church. As Christianity began to organize, hierarchy became necessary. Authority had to be externalized, doctrine had to be standardized, and rituals, fasting, prayer, almsgiving, became visible markers of righteousness, tools for cohesion, and methods of moral regulation. But Thomas belonged to an older current. In ancient mystery traditions, from Egypt to Greece to India, outer rituals were never the goal. They were symbols, training wheels for inner transformation. Once the inner work began, clinging to the outer form was seen as a regression. The danger was not disobedience, but substitution, replacing inner awakening with outward performance. This is the lens through which Jesus' words in Thomas must be read. When he speaks against fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, he is not attacking compassion or discipline. He is attacking spiritual theater, acts done to appear holy, to reassure the ego, or to negotiate favor with God, as if the divine were an external authority keeping score. In the ancient world, fasting was often a display of piety. Prayer was frequently public and formulaic. Almsgiving, though beneficial to others, could inflate the giver's sense of moral superiority. These acts created identity. I am righteous. I am devout. I am saved. And that identity was the problem. From the Thomasine perspective, the self that seeks recognition, whether from society or from God, is precisely the self that must dissolve. Awakening cannot occur while the ego is still collecting spiritual trophies. This is why such teachings were dangerous. A spirituality that requires no priest, no temple, no public proof of holiness cannot be easily controlled. A message that says, "The kingdom is already within you," undermines every system built on mediation, guilt, and deferred salvation. So Thomas was buried, its sayings labeled heretical, confusing, even demonic. And in its place rose a safer message, one that emphasized belief over knowing, obedience over insight, and ritual over realization. Yet the words survived. And now, centuries later, they return, not to abolish spiritual practice, but to strip it naked. To ask a question that still unsettles us today: are you seeking transformation or merely performing spirituality? In the next section, we will begin to decode what Jesus actually meant, line by line, and why these practices, when misunderstood, can become obstacles rather than pathways. Let us begin with the most unsettling realization of all. Jesus is not condemning fasting, prayer, or charity themselves. He is exposing what happens when the ego disguises itself as holiness. In the Gospel of Thomas, every saying functions like a mirror. It does not tell you what to do. It reveals who you are while doing it. And in saying 14, Jesus turns 3 of the most sacred religious acts into a spiritual diagnostic. If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves. In the ancient mystical sense, sin does not mean moral failure. It means division, to be split from your true nature. When fasting becomes an act of self-denial, performed to gain spiritual status, it strengthens the very illusion it claims to destroy. The body is punished, the ego is rewarded. You suffer outwardly while secretly congratulating yourself inwardly. This is not liberation, it is spiritual inflation. True fasting, in the mystical sense, was never about abstaining from food. It was about abstaining from illusion, from false identity, compulsive thought, and unconscious reaction. To starve the body while feeding the ego is to reverse the alchemy. If you pray, you will be condemned. This line disturbs people because prayer is assumed to be universally good. But Jesus here is addressing prayer as negotiation, a plea to an external God who withholds blessings and dispenses favor. This kind of prayer reinforces separation. I am here. God is there. Condemnation, in this context, is self-judgment. When prayer becomes a performance, recited words, borrowed language, rehearsed humility, it traps the mind in comparison and expectation. You begin measuring yourself. Did I pray enough? Did I pray correctly? Am I worthy? And the moment spirituality becomes measurement, the inner silence necessary for awakening disappears. Mystics across traditions echo this warning. The Tao Te Ching says, when the Tao is lost, morality appears. The Upanishads insist that the self cannot be reached through words or rituals. Silence, not supplication, is the doorway. And if you give alms, you will harm your spirits. This is perhaps the most misunderstood line of all. Charity, when genuine, relieves suffering. But almsgiving as identity, as proof of virtue, feeds a subtle hierarchy. Giver and receiver, righteous and lacking, elevated and inferior. The ego thrives on this polarity. When you give to feel good about yourself, you are not dissolving the self. You are fortifying it. From the Thomasine perspective, the highest form of compassion is not an act. It is a state of being. When the illusion of separation collapses, generosity flows naturally, without calculation, without self-image. Jesus is pointing towards something radical. Any practice that strengthens the sense of a separate I cannot lead to awakening, even if it wears sacred clothing. This is why these sayings feel dangerous. They do not offer comfort. They offer exposure. And yet, the question remains, if not fasting, prayer, or almsgiving as we know them, then what replaces them? In the next section, we will descend deeper into the paradox at the heart of Thomas and uncover the inner practice Jesus was actually teaching, one that requires no ritual, no audience, and no reward. But it demands everything else. If Jesus was not rejecting spiritual discipline, then what was he unveiling in its place? The answer lies in a principle so simple, it evades the conditioned mind. Awakening is not something you do. It is something you stop pretending to be separate from. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus repeatedly dismantles the idea of progress-based spirituality. He does not speak of climbing toward God. He speaks of recognition, remembering, seeing what has always been present. And this is where fasting, prayer, and almsgiving become dangerous, because they imply distance. They suggest that the divine is earned rather than uncovered. This is the paradox. To the ego, effort feels spiritual, striving feels holy. But to the awakened awareness, effort often conceals fear. The fear that what you already are is not enough. Thomas invites a reversal. Instead of fasting from food, Jesus hints at fasting from false narratives. The stories you tell yourself about who you are, what you lack, and what you must become. Instead of prayer as speech, he gestures toward prayer as perception, a state of attentiveness so complete that nothing is excluded. And instead of almsgiving as transaction, he points to unity, where compassion arises not from duty, but from recognition. This is why he says elsewhere in Thomas, "When you make the two one, then you will enter the kingdom." The two are inner and outer, sacred and ordinary, self and other. When these collapse, ritual becomes redundant. But here is where misunderstanding often occurs. Some read Thomas and conclude, "Then I don't need practices at all." That is not what is being said. The problem is not practice. It is attachment to the identity of the practitioner. The moment you say, "I am someone who fasts, prays, or gives," the ego has reclaimed the throne. In advanced mystical traditions, this is known as spiritual bypass, using sacred acts to avoid confronting the deeper illusion of selfhood. You can meditate for decades and never awaken if meditation becomes a refuge for identity. Jesus is calling out this exact danger. This also explains why these teachings were reframed as heretical. A religion that tells you salvation depends on inner clarity rather than outer conformity is unmanageable. It cannot be enforced, it cannot be quantified, and it cannot be sold. So the radical interiority of Thomas was replaced with external obligation. Yet traces of this inner teaching survived. The Desert Fathers spoke of pure prayer as wordless awareness. Sufi mystics warned against public piety. Zen masters laughed at ritual when it hardened into habit. Even Meister Eckhart centuries later would say, "I pray God to rid me of God." These are not rejections of the sacred, they are refusals of illusion. The Gospel of Thomas is not anti-spiritual, it is post-performative. It asks a question few dare to ask. If no one were watching, no community, no God, no future reward, would you still seek truth? Because only then does the seeking become real. In the final section before application, we must face the most uncomfortable truth of all, that these practices fail, not because they are weak, but because they succeed too well at strengthening the ego. And unless that is seen clearly, no ritual can save you. In the next section, we will turn this insight inward and explore how to apply it without falling into apathy, arrogance, or spiritual nihilism. Now comes the most delicate part of this teaching, because insight without embodiment becomes just another form of spiritual entertainment. If Jesus was warning against fasting, prayer, and almsgiving as identity, how does one live this wisdom without falling into laziness, nihilism, or egoic superiority? The answer is subtle, and it requires honesty rather than effort. The first practice is inner fasting. For one day, do not fast from food. Fast from self-narration. Notice how often the mind says, I am doing well, I am failing, I am spiritual, I am behind. Each of these thoughts feeds the sense of a separate doer. When such thoughts arise, do not fight them. Simply refrain from believing them. This is the fasting Jesus hinted at, starving the false self of attention. The second practice is silent prayer. Set aside 10 minutes. Do not speak. Do not ask. Do not visualize. Sit in alert stillness, not waiting for anything. The moment you notice yourself trying to pray, relax. Awareness itself is the prayer. This aligns with the ancient mystical insight that God is not addressed through words, but recognized through presence. If restlessness arises, good. You are touching the threshold where performance collapses. The third practice is anonymous generosity. Give in ways that cannot be traced back to you. No credit, no identity reinforcement, no internal story about being good. This dissolves the hierarchy between giver and receiver. Over time, you may notice something extraordinary. Generosity becomes effortless, almost impersonal, as if life itself is moving through you. This is what Jesus meant by protecting the spirit. But obstacles will appear. The ego will whisper, then nothing matters. That is a lie. Everything matters, without the weight of self-image. Or it will say, I've transcended religion. That too is a trap. Transcendence does not announce itself. The true sign of integration is simplicity. Less need to prove, less hunger for recognition, less anxiety about progress. You become quieter, not withdrawn, but transparent. And slowly something shifts. Spiritual acts stop being strategies. They become expressions. You may still fast, but without identity. You may still pray, but without words. You may still give, but without a giver. This is the narrow path Thomas points toward. Not asceticism, not indulgence, but clarity. And clarity, once tasted, is irreversible. The Gospel of Thomas does not ask you to abandon spirituality. It asks you to strip it of illusion. When Jesus said, do not fast, do not pray, do not give alms, he was not negating the sacred. He was protecting it from corruption by the ego. He was warning that the greatest obstacle to awakening is not sin, but self-conscious holiness. Fasting can starve truth. Prayer can reinforce separation. Charity can inflate the self, unless they are emptied of identity. What remains then is not emptiness, but presence, a way of being where the sacred is no longer performed, but lived, where the kingdom is not approached, but recognized, where nothing needs to be added, only seen. So here is the question to leave you with. If all spiritual roles were taken away, No seeker, no devotee, no good person. What remains aware right now? Sit with that. If this exploration stirred something in you, stay with the text. Read Thomas slowly. Let it unsettle you. And if you wish, share your reflections below, not as answers, but as questions still burning. Because the deepest teachings were never meant to comfort. They were meant to awaken. There is one final layer to this teaching, one that rarely gets spoken aloud. The saying in Thomas does not merely challenge religion, it watches the reader. Every time you revisit it, it asks a different question, because you are different. When you are driven by guilt, it sounds harsh. When you are driven by pride, it sounds threatening. But when you are quiet, truly quiet, it sounds like mercy. Because what Jesus is ultimately protecting is not doctrine, it is freedom. Freedom from bargaining with God. Freedom from performing goodness. Freedom from turning the infinite into a checklist. The tragedy of religion is not that it created rituals, but that it forgot they were meant to disappear. Like ladders used to climb a wall, they were never meant to be carried forever. Thomas preserves a voice before that forgetting. A voice that says, stop acting holy. Start seeing clearly. A voice that refuses to meet you in your mask. A voice that speaks only to what is real in you. That is why these words still feel dangerous. They do not tell you who to follow. They do not tell you what to believe. They do not even tell you what to do. They leave you alone with awareness itself, and that for most people is the last thing they want. But for those who are ready, it is the beginning of something that cannot be taken away. In the next exploration, we will look at another forbidden saying from Thomas, one that claims the end is not in the future, and the beginning is not in the past. Until then, watch your spirituality closely. Because the ego does not fear sin nearly as much as it fears silence.